Right. Carl Kreisman, thank you for coming to the Winter Park Library's continuing series on understanding the civic structure of our society. They began this a year ago, and we already have plans going into next year for different topics we want to cover. And I promise you, when we planned this day and this topic, we weren't trying to forecast the situation that we find ourselves in a country where questions about presidents is at the forefront of the conversation. That will not be our topic, but as I was driving over, I'm like, oh, it's obviously apropos perhaps to be talking about this. However, it is fair to say, as we just dive right on in, that from my perspective, over the past decade, maybe a little longer, the party that's not in power often is quite loud. It's partisans, it's elected officials, the media outlets that maybe more represent them, in suggesting that the president is using power either unwisely or in ways that are not afforded to the office. It's interesting how we only have two parties, as you know. We have others, but there's only two that ever seem to be in power. And they've both been in and out of power over the past decade and a half, 2 decades. So both of them accuse the other of doing, it's very interesting, right? And so this raises the question, which I think is central to an idea of a government like ours, which says it's a government of the people. How much power should a centralized figure or position, an executive office, have? And you can see the concerns about this when you look at, since 2000, we've had 908 by last count executive actions. That seems like a lot to me. It actually is lower than previous decades, believe it or not. I'll show you in a second. Well, you can actually just sort of see it up there. Here, when we had the progressive presidents, President Roosevelt averaged 145 a year. President Wilson, 220 a year. And he was in office for 8 years. So you can see that's over 1,000 for one president, 2 terms, 8 years. Right? So our last 20 years has been less than President Wilson. Now, well, the problem, in just a generalized term, which is why we're kind of talking about it, is you say, well, wait a minute. Are we some sort of a system in which either we, the people directly, or at least our representatives, are supposed to vote on things and somewhat talk to us and then make a decision about whatever it may be and then go from there? There's not really a role that I'm aware of in which we at any point just gave over some decision-making opportunity to anybody. I mean, even Congress is supposed to vote to go to war. And the whole idea of voting to do X would mean that if we, the people, are unhappy with that decision, at some point we would hold them accountable. Well, we may not be able to stop them from going to war at that moment, but we can sure as heck cost the person who voted for war to lose their office by getting a different representative, because we can say, we, the people, are unhappy with that decision. That's the general premise. So when you say there's actions that a president or a person or the executive office can just take indiscriminately, with seemingly no one to check or balance it, that doesn't seem like what I was taught in school. I watched, Schoolhouse Rock. I'm pretty sure that's not the way it was designed. And so what we want to try to deal with today is to try to figure out some of these core questions that lie at the heart of our civic structure. And like I said, in one sense, if all of us in the room, we're on a rocket ship to Mars, and we're the only ones, and we're going to design a society there, you and I, these are questions you and I would want to face. It is the question that has been in the human structure from the beginning. So you've been here before, and you've seen a slide I've showed, I don't have it today, of the normative state for the humans is what I call the power pyramid, in which at the very top, there is one single person or a small cadre of people who have, we would use the term, all executive power. And, then there's the weirdos like the Athenians and the Romans and some people in Switzerland and the Netherlands and then us in the 1700s who constructed a different system. And so, well, what would you want it to be? There's not a right answer. I'll just tell you that. And part of the challenge that confronts us, I think, is in our current day, is trying to discern, well, what do I think is best? We'll come back to our current day at the end in a very brief little glance. But what we want to do is try to understand, what did the founders plan? How did we work it out at the very beginning? So what do we see with President Washington in particular? Washington, Adams, Jefferson. And then if they had a plan, which they did, and this is not the plan, which it is not, then how do we depart from it? Who's guilty? And perhaps what may be shocking is that the guilty party is nobody in the 20th century. It actually changes much sooner than we think, which for me, I think, and people say, what do you study? What's your field? And basically revolutionary Europe is my field. So really from like the time of the Reformation, so 1500s for the French Revolution, American Revolution in that time period. So that time of change, but loosely what I tell people is that I've spent my career examining the human species and how societies morph and change over time. So I because I had the privilege of teaching at Valencia, we're always doing more the survey level courses, which is, you're flying across the continent in a jet, right? There's some mountains, those twinkly lights are a city. You're learning about it, but of course, you'd learn more if you got on the ground and went to the city and walked its streets, right? That's the idea. But there's a joy about being at this high up because you can see things that are not observable when you get down into the weeds a little bit. And one of the things that I would say is very observable to me is that we humans have a problem with power. It is the great challenge of interacting with each other and constructing societies. And how should they be constructed, and so what should it look like? So, as you know, because this is our citizen civics topic, we had a government, we changed the government. James Madison led the effort to reconstruct a second government about a decade later. It was widely opposed. We covered that, I think, last time we were together in this series. It was opposed because, as you can see, some of the rock stars of the revolution there, people like Sam Adams, Patrick Henry, they were loud and vociferous that the entire premise of what Madison was trying to do, which was, no hidden agenda, bring more power to the central government away from the states. Those rock stars of the revolution are like, that's a terrible idea, because the entire revolution was to move away from that. And if you've been here before, and many of you have, big fan of Locke and Hobbes, and so you should see it in the lens of Locke and Hobbes and how they're talking about it. But before we go to that slide, I just want to emphasize for Madison, you have to give Madison the benefit of the doubt. He was accused of being a terrible person for leading this effort. But he was active in the Congress of the Articles of Confederation. It was a group that often failed to have a quorum. So we complain about our Congress maybe not getting anything done because they're deadlocked or stalemated or whatever. They didn't get anything done because nobody came. I mean, that would be a much, I think, worse setting if we started finding out that none of the representatives or senators were showing up in D.C. They'd just sort of given up and nobody was there, because that would raise some really serious questions about, well, what are we doing as a supposedly unified country, or a country under one government in 2023? And so he was determined something had to be fixed. Keep in mind at this point, John Adams is in England, Thomas Jefferson is in France. They're like our first diplomats. Franklin, of course, had been there earlier when we got the alliance with France. So the world center was Europe. And so these two men are able to give us a framework about our reputation. Now you have to remind yourself also, we're a nothing country. Nobody cared about us. We're quite insignificant. Betting people assumed we would never last. When you look at all the details on the ledger sheet and you try to measure it all out, all the evidence suggests we don't make it past 25 years. Not so much vulture circling, but certainly the powerful, certainly we're in a setting by which, meaning powerful countries like France or Spain or England, were ready to make their next move 20 or 30 years later to expand their power, right? So from Europe, men like James Madison are hearing letters from Adams and Jefferson to suggest we look really weak to European eyes. And in a country that looks weak to an opponent, may be a country that's ready to make takeover moves. Adams in particular was constantly worried about our finances. And so he was always trying to, we need to get a loan. But some of you have been in settings where you've gone to the bank for a loan and they look at you and basically say, I don't think you're going to make it. I don't like your plan. I'm not going to give you money because I think I will lose money when your system, your idea, your dream fails. And they usher you out of the bank and you don't have the money. And that was the United States asking for help financially. And they're like, yeah, we're not giving y'all any money. So Madison is hearing this, which is what leads him down this road. Now, that's not to say the others are not hearing it also. Their argument, and we went over this last time, would have been, give it time. I mean, it's not even been really a decade with the government. Just give it a minute. But Madison thought we can't. So, of course, then that led to the convention. And again, the argument is it's about Hobbes. Now, this is important to bring Hobbes in because of the question we're talking about. How much power should the president have? In his very famous book, Leviathan, Hobbes is the first, or one of the very first, to suggest that a human society is a social contract and you're working together with one another. Hobbes's view, which we've covered here at length before, if you've not really studied Hobbes, I really urge you to. Locke's the rock star. Everybody loves to study Locke, and everybody likes to look at all the others that come after him, but Hobbes is really the one you need to see. And again, if you can understand Locke and Hobbes, put those as a lens that you look at everything in our country's history, so much becomes clear. Well, Hobbes suggests the human is not by nature good, but instead the human by nature is self-focused. And because they're self-focused, they will always, in push comes to shove, do what's in their best interest, even if it ends up harming you, the neighbor. So we must enter into a social contract, but then, Hobbes adds, that contract must be protected. Well, how is it protected? Hobbes argues you put all the power into the central government. In other words, you enter the social contract knowingly giving up your individual power to the central government. So that then when push comes to shove and your natural inclination is to act self-focused, you don't because you're afraid. Because you know who could come and get you, the central government, for acting poorly towards your neighbor. Now, you and I don't have to like that. We're not having a debate here about the best philosophy. We've covered Locke and Hobbes at length in multiple sessions here. But I do think Hobbes is on to something. And I think it's fair, although Madison would have disagreed, and Madison supporters would take me to task for saying it, but Madison is walking towards Hobbes. There's no doubt in my mind that's what he's doing. He wants to bring more power to central government. Interesting thing with Hobbes and Leviathan, though, is that Hobbes is often accused of saying monarchy is the only way. That is not what he says. What he says is the issue is a question of power. Now, when he then says, what are my options for how power can be executed, he does agree a single person, i.e. a monarch, which is the only thing he would have known about, is that best option. But it could be done in a sort of legislative system. But he just felt that would be problematic. Now, there's a lot more down the road with Hobbes. But so this is in the minds of everybody when they're in Philadelphia debating, well, what kind of government are we going to have? So when they get to the question then of how are they going to design things, Madison shows up with his very famous Virginia plan in which he basically lays out everything he wants to do. And in it, he has an executive branch. Well, the executive branch arguably got the most debate amongst the people in Philadelphia. Now, unfortunately for you and me, they really didn't handle the Constitutional Convention in what we would call kind of an organized fashion, and there wasn't a note taker. And a lot of times they would talk about things, seemingly have a vote, and then 3 weeks later somebody would bring it back up and say, we're going to talk about this again. And then have a new vote. And they go back and forth on things. So it's kind of a hard journey to follow if you've ever read any of the scholars about what happened in Philadelphia. if they're being candid with you, they'll tell you it's a very difficult story to follow when we have incomplete evidence. We have good evidence from what happened from various note takers, Madison in particular, but it's incomplete, right? But so this idea of having executive office immediately brought fears of monarchy. There's no way to set up a system in 1780, 1790, and say we're going to have a governance with a single leader and not have everybody in the room assume you mean a monarch. Madison took great pains to say, no, to be an elected official. They did set up a system by which they could only be there for 4 years, but they could be reelected. Some wanted it forever. Alexander Hamilton wanted the president to be for life. And he really wanted it to be a monarch because he believed it would be best for stability's sake. And so they're really arguing about this case. The opponents of the idea, well, there was a group that said no executive. Because remember, in the Articles of Confederation, there's no executive branch. The government was run by Congress. There's no judicial branch. There's no executive branch. Okay, so there's no executive. So there was opponents who said, yeah, I don't want to do that. Most could see Madison's point, but they're like, well, we can't put all the power in one hand. That's too dangerous. So they proposed a variety of schemes with a 3-person, kind of like the Roman setup. The French tried this later. Different groups. The Spartans had 2. The Roman consul was 2, but if you had the tribune, it's 3, a 3-headed leadership. They thought maybe we could have a kind of an executive from the north, from the middle, from the south. I don't know how they do that today with the whole continent, the way it's spread out. And that went back and forth. In the end, George Washington's presence is the reason why they will mitigate the conversation. So Washington is Madison's great coup. When he's arguing to try to get this to happen, he knows he's going to be hit with charges of treason. So he wants Washington there to deflect all that. Washington is a hard sell, but eventually Madison wins him over. Washington comes. He's immediately chosen the chair, which is great for Washington because he doesn't want to talk about it. And so he doesn't say very much the entire time. But when the executive branch was discussed, and they start talking about, well, would there be a salary involved? And would this person possibly be, could they be bribed? I mean, Franklin brings this up. We're going to have money involved. Does some single person having power? Couldn't they be a target for bribery in one way or another? Washington famously left the chair, turned it over to another, and came down and sat down at the Virginia table. He didn't say anything, but the whole point of Washington doing that was his own acknowledgement that most everybody in the room realized if we have a first executive, it'll be Washington. So that was interesting because that really colored the conversation, because there were probably more people in the room who wanted to oppose the executive in total or deeply limit the executive, far more limited than where they left it. But they wouldn't say it openly for fear of insulting Washington. If they say the president will be a tyrant, or the president will use the military illegally, or as Franklin said, the president might get bribed, it's kind of tough to say. What you're really saying is you think Washington is open to a bribe. And of course, that's not what people thought, but it could sound that way. So it's interesting, Washington's presence in the room really kind of colors the conversation. And at the end, they will vote. They voted by state. They will vote 7-3 for a single executive over a multi-person executive. And they'll begin the process of figuring out how much power do we give the executive. And many of the people, including Madison, who made notes, observed that they felt like people did not say everything they were thinking because General Washington was in the room and, was not, they didn't want to say anything that would allude to him kind of in the process. Again, remember, there were some, like Hamilton, who wanted to be further, but what's interesting to then notice, what were they trying to set up? They were trying to say that the power would be not between a ruler and the people, but that the power would kind of rest all the power, the Constitution would rest all the power in the people. So the people collectively would have the power. This is something that I feel like maybe for my entire life, so way back into the 20th century, we've lost this understanding that the power rests with the people. And we do see the elected officials and certainly the president as something other. Joe Ellis is a historian who I like a lot, and he famously said one way to understand the question they were asking in Philadelphia is the government us, or is the government them? And I would just say in my lifetime, it feels like more people would say the government's them. And there's things, somebody could argue that various and sundry leaders in Congress and state houses and governors and presidents have acted in a way that they are not with us specifically. So once they made this decision, they had to figure out a few rules, a few issues. One of the big ones that concerned people was the power of the military. By making the president the commander-in-chief, were you not perhaps giving the president a military force power? Now you have to remind yourself, go back to the whole Revolutionary War situation. One of the whole reasons the United States does not have a focus on its military in its constitution or its governing structure was because of how the military was used during the Revolutionary War. And of course, there was no police at the time. So of course, the British troops were used in a law kind of controlling scenario, particularly as some of the cities like Boston began to spiral out of control. But to the average citizen, it looked like the king was using his muscle, the army, how he wished, even to oppose our rights. Why could a president not do the same thing? And if the president was confronted with impeachment, which was something that they wanted to put in there, or if the president was confronted with losing an election, could the president not then just call on the military as the commander-in-chief? Now, it's been a long time. President Eisenhower, I think, well, President Kennedy, but President Eisenhower, the last time we had a general elected as an official. And in my lifetime, I guess I would just say, perhaps naively, I'll be naive, I never have thought of the president as like leading the armies out into warfare. Right? They're bureaucrats. They're business people. They sit in an office and they tell generals. And we have a joint chiefs of staff who do all that stuff. But remember what we're talking about here. It wasn't that long ago before kings were on the horses leading their troops into battle. The whole idea of the kind of Middle Ages story of dukes and nobles, they would lead their troops into battle. So the person at the top of the power pyramid going into battle was not some weird thing that had happened. And so, and the fact that Washington had been our commanding general just a decade before, that was in people's minds. Again, they're not going to say it because it's Washington, but what if somebody like Alexander Hamilton became in charge? And this very thing is the kind of thing that later both Hamilton and Aaron Burr will do, in which one could argue they were trying at different moments to raise armies that they could lead for political purposes. So this was something that people were like, wait a minute, do we really want to do that? Now they left it in, but they left it in with some debate about that being advisable. This is probably one of the ones that had Washington not been in the room, it might not have been the state. It might have been something else was decided, that there maybe Congress was in charge of, commander-in-chief or something like that, Speaker of the House even. But because it was Washington, they felt like to go for it. This idea of executive actions, which I first mentioned, it's not in the Constitution directly, but there is this idea where it says the executive will take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Well, from that, Washington, very first, so it's not anybody later, it's Washington, who first issues the very first executive action, which was a command to his various federal heads of state to give him a full, precise, and distinct general idea of the affairs of the United States. Now, again, between him and between him and Andrew Jackson, so 6 presidents, there's only 9 executive actions. So they just don't do it. But it's something that they did. They said, we want to do this, and I need this information, kind of a thing. Then perhaps the biggest debate was over whether the president had veto. Now this will show you Madison, where Madison wanted to go. Madison wanted the president or the executive office to have a veto power over any and all state law. Let that sink in for a second. It's pretty significant. That was the setting in England. The king had a veto over any law or decision made within his realm, even if it hadn't come from Parliament. Now, they didn't have states like we do, but in their various places. Well, this is a big reach. Madison, when he first got there, was writing to a friend, and he basically said, this is a hill I'll die on. I'll leave without there being a constitution if I don't get this. For Madison, it was crucial to demonstrate to the states that they did not have supreme power. Now that should have a lot to do in your mind as you think about the Civil War, some of the debates we've had throughout our 250 years as to who's in charge. We'll come back to this more in a second. But just interesting seeing that Madison's going to change in his lifetime because of the influence of Jefferson. But still, it's kind of, wow. That is voted down. He can't even eventually convince the Virginians. I think there's not a one here, meaning Virginia, because he finally just gives up. So, all right, fine. Nobody's going to go with it. And he was very disappointed. And there is some hint, he wasn't going to leave the convention, but that he had sort of, at the moment it got beaten, he's like, I don't know if I want to keep going. He did, obviously, to our good fortune, keep going, and we got the Constitution that we got. But it's a big deal. He did, however, though, as you know, get the veto. The president could tell the Congress no. Now, this is a crucial question that's going to come up in the kind of body of our discussion here. Because if Congress, back up, if our government is we the people, and if the system is designed that government is us, not them, and then if we have representatives who are making the decisions for us in this system, by what right could we suggest one individual gets to say no to the whole thing? Now, there's maybe an answer for that, but I'm not saying I have an opinion that I'm telling you. I just want you to wrestle with it and think, wait a minute. Yeah, whether we call ourselves a republic, which is what we are, or even more so if we claim we're a democracy, which we're not, but we like to claim it. The idea that one individual could on his, or maybe one day her own initiative say, yeah, we're not doing that. Whoa, that challenges the whole system. But Madison was determined to give appropriate power to the executive office. And again, part of this is building the balance, right? They're trying to balance between the different styles of where government has, the judicial branch has power, the congressional branch has power, and they just come from a setting where there was no executive. So Madison thought, we need to have somebody who can kind of smack Congress on the wrist. But they give Congress, as you know, the override, which allows them then to go forward if they want to go forward. So it's a good compromise in kind of how they work their way forward from there. Now, the most controversial was how we're going to pick this person. And we've covered this before, so I don't want to get too lost here because we want to get on into Jackson. But ultimately, they didn't have a good idea. There were some 60 votes, meaning 60, well, not 60 different. At one point, they voted on letting the people vote on it like 4 times. There were like 8 or 9 votes in which they let the states choose. So they really were down to 3 or 4 choices. Should we let the people decide? That was largely a no-go. Because again, like it, don't like it, we're not a democracy. And they're like, last thing we want to do is make sure the president is somehow a popularity figure. But should we let the states choose this person? What about letting Congress choose the person so then the people had that kind of movement indirectly? That's an idea. And they went back and forth and debated. And so ultimately what they decided was, which is, again, I've gone into this at length, so I'm not going to here today. I think it's a beautiful decision. I often quote the Obi-Wan quote to Luke Skywalker in the Star Wars when he's describing the lightsaber. It's a more elegant weapon for a more civilized age. That if we don't understand it today, that's some different things. However, there are good reasons to critique some of the things that has happened with our electoral college. I'll just leave it there and say that they finally made a decision for a deflective kind of choice, what they hoped. And it's arguable that after 1820 it never happened. But what they had hoped was that the wisest people, which I understand that's elitist, and if you don't think you're one of the wise people, then you might think, well, how come I don't get a voice? But the wisest people in each state would then choose independently people. You, sir, are going to be one of the electors. You, ma'am, are going to be one of the electors. You, sir, are going to be one of the electors. We trust you. Go make a decision. I don't have to worry about it anymore, and I know you'll do fine. And then on your own, you go and decide. And by our Congress today, in 2024, if they wanted to, they could elect Oprah to be president. Oprah didn't run. Doesn't matter. not about whether you run or not. It's what the Electoral College decides. And each elector, by law, has the right to pick two different people to cast their two votes for. Now, I know they don't do that, and there's a whole other conversation, which we will not go down, I'll never get out of here, with the Electoral College. But just understand, that's their idea behind it. I still think it's plausible, but regardless. And of course, if, this is important for where we're going to go, if nobody gets a majority within the Electoral College, still to this day, thankfully I would say, you should never even pay attention to the popular vote. When the telecasters start talking to you about the popular vote, just la, 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 I'm not listening, because that doesn't mean anything. All that you need to pay attention to is the vote of the electors. And by the way, if you think that's a stupid idea, Carl, it's a stupid plan, then please lead for a new electoral amendment to the Constitution and let's get rid of it. But do it the legal way and convince everybody else you're right. You probably have a majority on your side, probably can make it happen. Then if not, it goes to the House of Representatives. So, what did Adams and Jefferson think? Well, Adams and Jefferson both were concerned when they heard about it. They liked the Constitution. They felt the Articles was bad. They had seen the weaknesses of our reputation in these states. And so they're like, well, I'm not so sure. Adams is the founder who dealt the most with thinking in terms of good governance. And he had just completed a new book, Defense of the Constitutions, about what we were trying to do. Because what we were trying to do in America was considered odd, weird, and unknown by everybody in Europe. And he wanted to explain it. He had written singularly the Massachusetts Constitution, which, by the way, is still the same thing he passed. It's the longest lasting Constitution. It's been amended, of course, in which he basically designed this idea of mixing the government. And he notes that one of the first things he was concerned about, there's no Bill of Rights. Now, we're going to talk about the Bill of Rights later, but not today. But that idea, there's not a specific list of rights. For Adams, when he had written the Massachusetts Constitution and his ideas, he noted, Hobbes does the same thing, that there's three basic types of government: government of the people, government of the single, government of the group. And Adams thought, Hobbes agreed with him, Hobbes said the same thing, the best way to go is to try to combine these things. Now, for Adams, he wanted to avoid any hint of Leviathan, so he did not want supreme power to be in any one area. He wanted a mixed setting in which each of these groups got some power. And so that was the original design, that there were certain things that could only be done by certain parts of the government, and the other parts of the government were not allowed to kind of do that. And for him, this is what the Romans had done, and that's why it's a republic. And he called that a republic of laws, not of men, because a government and democracy, it's flawed because it depends on humans, not on laws. Meaning, of course, democracies can pass laws, but they're sort of pointless because the very next day, we the people can vote on the same issue again. There's no point in which the issue is actually solved because it's always majority rules. Always majority rule. You can't have the override vote in our Constitution and say we're a democracy because now you're 2/3. A democracy is always majority rules, period. You can redefine a new government and say it's like a democracy, and then you go from there. In any case, as you can see, he wanted to have a representative assembly that should be split into two parts. This is where Adams thought you hide the elite or that power of the group. You hide them there in one part of you give them a spot, otherwise they'll be frustrated if they don't have a spot. You give the people a spot, you give the average people a spot. Then you have a separate judiciary. It's one of Adams' key insights that nobody else was really talking about up to him. He wants the judiciary to be independent, separate, not connected politically. And then, of course, you have an executive. And the executive, for Adams, should have veto power. Okay, so he's happy with that part of it. What's interesting is that Adams actually felt like the president, as he read the Constitution, did not have enough power. This will show up when he becomes the president. Jefferson, though, is aghast that there's an executive. Remember where he is, 1787. What's happening? French Revolution's exploding. They haven't cut off the king's head yet, but they're going to. And for Jefferson, he's like, yeah, this is great. The ball of liberty is going to roll and roll across the world, and woohoo, freedom, they're all going to follow us. And then he's like, I cannot believe, he's writing to Madison, that you have put in a president. That's his very first complaint. Here's what I don't like. First, well, he didn't like the Bill of Rights, but then he goes on and says, well, there's an executive. How is that? And there's no limit to the executive. And the executive can be elected forever. And with somebody popular like Washington, what would stop him from being there forever? If you begin to elect the president in perpetuity, isn't that just like a monarch? So that's his argument. You already see the battle between Jefferson and Hamilton. You can see it coming long before you get there, because it's coming, because they're going to have vastly different viewpoints on what a good government should look like. In the letters between Adams and Jefferson, it is interesting, because this will come up between these two men who at this point are good friends, as you know, will become enemies, and then eventually reconcile. Adams says, you're afraid of the one, meaning the single leader. I, the few, meaning the power of the elite crowd. The elite crowd is the one that worries me the most. For Adams, you needed the president to be strong enough to oppose the elite. I think Adams would have liked Theodore Roosevelt, because as we'll see, well, we won't go into depth, but if you study Roosevelt's life, he uses the power of the presidency to oppose the uber rich of his day. And he does it with bombasticness, but also with threat. Like, I'll just take your business from you, which he probably did not have legal right to do, but he's like, I'm going to. And that's a great imagery of what do you think Adams meant? Well, Adams wanted, you know, you live in Europe with the aristocracy, and there's no limit to their power. The king really doesn't have a limit to their power, right? So you study European history, the aristocracy really is the dominant player, depending on the different settings we look at. And so Adams knows this, and he's like, we have an aristocracy. Jefferson, you're one of them. If we're not careful, we'll have the same problems as Europe has. And many of us would suggest maybe that's what we're living in our own day. Just leave it there for now. Where you have an elite wealth class that has amazing amounts of power, and they kind of are untouchable. And so then who could stop them? For Adams, the president. Well, whether you agree with him or not, that's not the point, but that's kind of was his position. And he says, you know, you're apprehensive of monarchy. Well, I'm apprehensive of aristocracy. Well, as the first executive, because of course he was obviously elected president, Washington was very clear that he is building a model. Now, what's interesting is that he was determined to try to provide dignity to the role at a time when, as I've already told you, the country, you could largely say, was not well regarded internationally. So he did various and sundry things. Right? So he had an ongoing set of meetings. They're called a levee, in which he and Martha would sit on a dais, about, you know, like lifted up platform, where people walking in could see the back of the line. You turn the corner, like the queue at Disney. You're like, oh, look, there's Mickey. Right, there's George Washington. I see him on the dais. You know, and they'd meet and they'd shake hands and they'd brief conversation with people as they walked on past. He bought, the country bought a very famous coach. If you ever go to Mount Vernon, that coach is there, drawn by 4 horses, and he had a large cadre of servants. It's not my understanding that he brought any of his slaves from Mount Vernon. Jefferson, I believe, is the first person to bring slaves to the White House or to the Executive House. They, of course, were in New York at this time. They were not in Virginia. But he had a group of servants who took care of him and Martha. He did other things to try to make sure that you didn't become overwhelmed with who he was, because he was aware that he was held in such high regard. So there's nothing in the Constitution about having a cabinet. And so he arranges for this. One way to understand what he was doing there was he was dispersing power, as opposed to keeping it all for himself to make decisions. And then he basically, and not all presidents have done this, but he basically then let them do their thing. And he would sort of mediate their conversations and their debates and their disagreements about their different areas. But he wanted them to do things. I love the fact that John Adams said Washington's gift of silence was his greatest political asset, something neither Adams or Jefferson had. Adams was a very talkative man, as somebody who's similar to that, I understand the danger of that process. But Washington could say nothing a lot. And so kind of have this almost this air of regal standing, which the word regal should throw us, right? We're like, wait, well, that's not good. But because it was Washington, everybody was cool with it. And in his credit on the ledger was he'd already had supreme power as the commander-in-chief of the military, and had been suggested to him in 1782 and 3 that he should just take over as a monarch or a dictator, because the Congress was so inept in those last few months of trying to get things settled with England. And he famously declined and famously went to Congress and handed over his sword and said, I'm going away, I'm retiring. And that's the moment when King George III is supposedly to have said, wow, Washington's the greatest man of the age. Because he did something most people don't do. He gave away power. So he's doing that here. So he's setting up this kind of setting that he's kind of innocent. But there were some issues. What do we call this person? Right? What's his name? It doesn't say in the Constitution. Adams and the Senate with him were concerned again with this AIR, A-I-R, of the viewpoint. Like, what's his reputation? I thought, well, he needs a nice title. It gets debated heavily in the Senate. Adams talks too much and kind of gets in trouble for talking too much. The House had already said, we're just going to use the President of the United States, which, of course, as you know, that's the choice they end up with. But this debate about the title is indicative of a lot of issues of still the uncertainty as to, well, how much power is this person supposed to have? What are they supposed to do? How do we perceive them? Are we supposed to bow in front of them? Are we supposed to shake their hand? Are we supposed to just treat... There's a very famous, although maybe apocryphal, story at the convention where somebody who had been on Washington's staff in the military at one point during a break went up to the dais where everybody's milling about and kind of just patted them on the shoulder and had a brief exchange. And the room like suddenly stopped because you touched George Washington. And Washington was not a happy camper. And he basically froze and gave the person a glare, and the person kind of moved his hand away and was like, okay, sorry. You know, so, well, who are we supposed to treat this person? Again, is government us or is government them? Are they in a different status than us? Now, in this, you get a picture of how Adams perceives things, which we're not going to get too much into Adams. You know what, you guys, none of you know how much I love him, but we're not going to spend any time on Adams. But he, again, is trying to protect the imagery. But this idea of imagery, I think, is important for understanding for where the debate's really going to go in just a second when we get to Jackson. The biggest concern or issue that comes up is in the first re-election. Washington, to his credit, wants to step down, largely because he's tired of getting criticized in the press, and because of his gift of silence. He never retaliated, just never said anything back. Hamilton did, but he didn't. And so he was kind of tired of it. And it was very aware to most observers that Jefferson was now on the outs with Washington. They will famously kind of end their relationship and go to their graves, hating's too strong, deeply disliking Washington in particular. Jefferson would lie to us and pass a lie detector test saying, oh, no, I was cool with Washington, over the way Jefferson treated Washington. And Washington got evidence to this, and so he's like, okay, I'm not talking to you anymore. And so in that process, should he run again? Which raised the whole issue. Now, of course, Hamilton's like, yes, you must run again. Surprisingly, Jefferson comes to him and says, look, you need to run again. You're the only thing that's going to hold us together in these very early years. And so he does run again, but it raises that whole issue of there's no limit in the original Constitution to how often the president could run. A person could run forever if they wanted to, till they died. And there was some concern about what if a person dies in office, what happens? It's not clear exactly what was supposed to happen if somebody died in office. I love this part here. This is where Washington is like, well, look, I have no sons. And so he was trying to suggest that there's no potential for a bloodline succession, which would have been quite normal. And when John Quincy Adams runs, although it's not as big of a deal, there is some concern about a son running from a previous president, like what is the imagery, particularly in that part there in the early 18th, 19th century, early 19th century. So what's happening with that? So it's an interesting kind of watch as to how they're wrestling with, should the person have power? Arguably, we could say from Washington until we get to Andrew Jackson, the presidents exhibited very little initiative of their own, very little actual power, particularly compared to the presidents post-Jackson. You see this with Jefferson. He definitely attempts to kind of change the atmosphere. He gets rid of the levees. He sells the coach. And Mount Vernon eventually had to buy it back, much later for their museum. He was seen riding around town on his horse. It'd be like if we saw any of our current leaders kind of on a bicycle or a Segway or something just around town by themselves in D.C., just on their own. He would famously, if somebody knocked on the door of the White House, he would often answer the door in his jacket, kind of, imagine you casually at home in your shorts or casual clothing, and somebody knocks on the door, no pretense. Just, hi, President Jefferson, I'm here to greet you. He does have some servants and brings a few slaves with him. But to his credit, he's basically trying to change the tone from regal to everyman. And I guess you could do that because he already had regal at Monticello. But he still, when you watch Jefferson, he still does demonstrate kind of this willingness to use presidential power when necessary. Although, to his credit, in limited moments. Okay, so that's kind of what the founders set up. That's what Washington kind of did for us. That takes us to this guy. Jackson is arguably the most controversial, I'm saying a lot here, I know, the most controversial president in our national history. He's certainly among the most consequential of our presidents. Now, just a quick snapshot on the backdrop. We don't have a lot of time here. Raised in the frontier, parents die young, participates in the American Revolution, has a deep disdain and really open hatred for Britain, gets very involved in the life of Tennessee politics, will be elected to various leadership roles, both military and judicial, gets involved in the War of 1812, raises a volunteer army, begins to kind of march south through modern-day Alabama, fights involved in battles all the way down to here. He comes to Pensacola, then goes over to Mobile, figures out, in his opinion, in 1815 or late 1814, the British are heading to New Orleans, races the British fleet there, successfully beats them in New Orleans. When he's there, he basically takes over the city. A lot of people were unhappy with him being in charge of things, but he was determined to defend the city. You get to remind yourself, at that point, New Orleans had only been a U.S. city for about a decade. So most people were quite ambivalent. They weren't, rah, rah, America, we're going to defend ourselves. It's like, yeah, we're just having a party. It's, it's New Orleans, come on. He jails a lot of really rich, powerful people. He basically takes over the city militarily, which is a hint of how Jackson perceives what he needs to do and how he needs to do it and when he's going to do it. And so in the process, he will successfully win the Battle of New Orleans and be catapulted to fame. He is the most famous person in America by 1815. Because of this, he will be seen by most people as the hero that we need. At that point, Spain still controlled Florida. We were having issues, not so much with Spain, but with Native Americans, as they were trying to hold on to their lands. Hint, hint, for where we're going to go. And so he basically asked President Monroe for permission. There's a he said, she said debate amongst historians. It's not really clear who said what to whom. But the story is that he wrote a letter to Monroe saying, if you give me permission to raise an army, I will go into Florida and I'll take care of this problem. Monroe says he never gave permission. Jackson said, yes, he did. Regardless, Jackson built an army, marched his way into Florida, took over the cities. As you can see, at one place there were 2 British citizens that he just decided were spies and had them executed. There's no evidence that they were spies. They might have been, but there's no evidence that they were. They might have just been business people, but he had them executed. and is instrumental in what becomes known as the John Quincy Adams, the Adams-Onis Treaty with Spain, in which we took over control of Florida. But part of that was because Adams was able to tell the foreign minister Onis, look, you guys can't control things. We just marched an army in there. You just need to give it to us. So again, to most Americans, Jackson seemed like, well, to some degree, the second coming of Washington, a military leader who had great power and charisma and was able to successfully lead us where we need to go. To his foes, though, remember where we are, he was very similar in tone and in action to the last evil dictator we had ever encountered, Napoleon Bonaparte. So you already can see kind of this big divide over Jackson. There's a whole, we could do a whole 2 or 3 sessions just on Jackson and what his life's about and kind of how to observe it. But just for our purposes here, think about this in terms of the questions that we're dealing with relative to the power of the executive office. And you have a man like Washington whose gift was silence and just didn't do things and had a cabinet in which he dispersed power. Well, what if you had somebody like a Napoleon, who not necessarily is a bad person, come in that position, who is very willing to use power however he feels necessary? So this takes us to the election of 1824. Now, there's a whole American history side of this that we don't have time to go through. But long story short is from Jefferson's victory in 1800 till this election in 24, the country had largely been with one political party, the Republican Party. That's Jefferson's Republicans, not the Republican Party of today. Jefferson's rules for 8 years. Because Washington only had 8 years, Jefferson took the same opportunity and stepped down after 8. They basically handpicked Madison. He gets to do it for 8 years. Then they basically handpicked Monroe. These are Jefferson's boys. So you basically get 24 years of one single party, one single president. 3 different men, but largely the same person. They're not identical. They have different viewpoints. There's other people who are involved in politics at this time if you go into depth here. But generally speaking, we have one party. If you were in politics, you were in the Republican Party. There's no other party to be a part of. And again, not our Republican Party. That does not exist yet. This is Jefferson's party. 1824. The party's flummoxed. We're not sure what to do. The 2 most popular political leaders are the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, and the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay. The most popular person in the country is Andrew Jackson, but all the political people are afraid of Andrew Jackson. And there's no Virginian to hand the party off to. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, they're all Virginians. Had there been a Virginian of any note, I think they would have just nominated the Virginian. John Quincy Adams arguably is next in line. He is the one that's most due. If there's ever a president who was ever groomed to be president, it's John Quincy Adams. And he was a good president. It would have been a great president had he had more freedom. That's a different conversation. Once the party won't make a selection, and there are arguments about how the party made selections, that it was kind of insider trading, again, pro-Virginian. So Massachusetts just says, we're going to put John Quincy up. And once that happened, Kentucky's like, oh, if we're going to go down that road, we're putting up Clay. Clay's better than John Quincy. And then, of course, Tennessee's like, we went in on this. Late in the game, the Republican Party's like, no, we're going to be with Crawford, who's a gentleman from Georgia. Well, all that ramifications leads to this. Think back to our conversation about the House of Representatives making the decision. Now, notice you have popular vote. The 1824 election is the first major election. They might have voted in 20, but in 1824, you started having states turn over the decision-making about the Electoral College to the people. Back to the Electoral College for a second. What the Constitution says is that each state legislature shall make a manner of its own choosing as to how the electors will be chosen. And as far as I'm aware, I haven't checked in a couple years, but as far as I'm aware, that's not been changed. What that means is, I've always made this as a silly example, Florida wanted to have a statewide arm wrestling contest, they could do it. I'm sure both parties would sue and try to go to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court was doing its job to be like, hey, that's what the state legislature decided. Your arm wrestling contest, you declare if you want to be in it, and who are you arm wrestling for? I'm arm wrestling for Elon Musk. Okay, great. And there'd be nothing you and I could do about it. Nothing. Meaning we wouldn't have to worry about vote, and they could turn off all the election ads. We wouldn't have to listen to any of them because we no vote here. There's nothing in the Constitution that connects public voting to the Electoral College. It just says the states decide. But here, by 24, start thinking 20, by 24 you have, I think it's actually majority, there's 24 states in 24, and I think somewhere 15, 16 states were allowing the people to vote. But it's a very small number. As we're about to see in the 4 years later, it'd be a much larger number as almost all the states by that point go down this road. And as you can see, Jackson gets the most votes in both parts. The electoral vote's all that matters, but you can see in neither one does he have the majority. And what the Constitution says, when there's a vote, the top 3 vote getters, which for you and me were like, top 3? When has there ever been 3? Rarely is there a third. But if you go back and look at the electoral votes in the early elections, there's always 8 to 10 people who got votes. And again, if I told you we're going to have an electoral vote right now, and you vote for you want to be the president in 2024, I feel like we would have maybe 20 or 30 names on private pieces of paper. Right? And I tell you, they don't have to be a political officer, and they don't have to want to do it. In fact, the fact that they don't want to do it, the founders would argue, is the best person put into the office. By corollary, a person who wants to do it is the last person you should put into the office, according to the founders. Now, that's not been true for a long time for us, but anyway, you get the picture. Now, look who comes in fourth, Clay. Who, what I just tell you Clay was? Speaker of the House. Who runs the House of Representatives? Speaker of the House. Where is the decision being made? House of Representatives. So the guy who comes in fourth is now going to get to control who becomes the president. Well, this should be a slam dunk because, again, most everybody's afraid of Jackson. And Adams, God bless his little heart, he is not a popular person. He is a very difficult person to be friendly with. He was very stiff. There's a long story here. I always feel very sad for John Quincy. Basically did not have a childhood, and so was not a very gregarious kind of person. So, in that setting, well, we just pick Crawford. Great. He has a stroke. And now Clay's stuck. Oh my gosh. We have to pick a person none of us like, John Quincy Adams, or a person we're all afraid of, Andrew Jackson. Of course, they picked John Quincy Adams, because at least they can know he's not going to blow things up, right? So yay! Except what happens next throws the whole story into a tizzy. Let me show you this slide here. You can just ignore all this part up here. But here's our president. I've left out John. Here's our president. And do you notice something? President, Secretary of State. Do you notice a pattern? Yeah. Who becomes the next president? Secretary of State. So once John Quincy Adams is chosen, when he picks Henry Clay to be the Secretary of State, what does that look like? Yeah, the quid pro quo, right? Got the hookup. Who decides? Speaker of the House. Who's Speaker of the House? Henry Clay. Oh, wow, new president made Henry Clay. Now, basically, there's no evidence that anything untoward happened. And there's probably good evidence that both camps, not the men themselves, but both camps were probably trying to buy Clay if they could. And I'm convinced it simply was the fact that Clay, who was also from, remember, Clay's a frontiersman, he's from Kentucky, like Jackson's a frontiersman from Tennessee. And the two men just sort of hated each other. And so for Clay, it's not so much I got bought, it's just I just hate you. And so that's the deal. John Quincy Adams, I think, made a really poor decision here, though, even though Clay probably was going to be a good Secretary of State because of the imagery. And of course, immediately Jackson comes out blasting this. And he'll spend the next 4 years trying to say, hey, look, this whole thing is screwed up. This whole thing's a cheat. These guys robbed me. They stole my election. Does that sound familiar at all? And it's a big ripoff. He will destroy the Republican Party. He'll create his own party. This is why it's so important to not call Jefferson's party the Democrat-Republican Party. It's Republicans. Now, there were Democrat-Republican societies in 1800, but there was no political party because you kind of robbed Jackson of his moment. Jackson creates the Democrat-Republican Party. So he's basically trying to say, hey, we're the Republicans, because there's only one party. We're the Republicans who believe in democracy. Because remember, I got ripped off. I mean, come on. I got screwed. I got the most votes. Aren't we a democracy? I mean, so Tocqueville just wrote his book, Democracy in America. This is where people started to get this idea, hey, we're a democracy. We're a democracy. Jackson's like, yeah, I got ripped off. Come on, people. But in the end, it's going to be successful. Because what John Quincy Adams should have said is, I don't care what he's calling us, we are the Republican Party. We are Jefferson's party. We're with the founders. But instead, they went with this lame national Republican and, of course, got crushed in the election. Now, look how much bigger the popular vote is. So almost all the states go down this road. Whole different conversation than our journey. But this is where you can begin to start seeing this idea of, no, we actually do live in a democracy. Jackson's the one who kind of begins beating that drum down that road. Now, what's interesting is, even though John Quincy Adams was the political opponent, his real enemy, as I already said to you, is Clay. Now, at this point, domestically, Clay has set up a thing called the American system. It's not by himself. It's been going on for 20 years. It was a system designed to say, coming out of the War of 1812, how do we strengthen ourselves economically, and how do we deepen our unity as a nation? And different parts to it. One part to it was building infrastructure, roads, railroads, canals. One part was creating a national bank. We had one with Hamilton, but it had been killed later. So brought back the national bank. It's very important to have a kind of national financial system. And we're going to start using tariffs, which are taxes on imported goods, in order to protect American industry. If we protect American industry, because remember, we're insignificant. We're not even on the charts of all the cool kids. We're nobodies. We want to help ourselves. We have to protect ourselves. Right? So that's what we're going to do. And Jackson, and many people who are Jackson supporters, believe the American system was only helpful to elitists. So this is part of Jackson's argument about this whole thing. So into this moment, Jackson's going to raise this question through a series of three major events as to what does it mean? Who has the power? Who represents the people? Does the president represent the people, or does Congress represent the people? What's the role of the common person? Are they supposed to be involved in the decision making or not? And these major three issues, he has multiple issues. We will have a few other presidents after Jackson who have tumultuous terms in office. But arguably nobody has the tumult of Jackson over his 8 years. The three biggies are these. On these three major issues, on all three moments, Jackson will utilize presidential power in a way unexpected by the founders. The founders would have been horrified. In fact, when he runs in 24, both Adams and Jefferson are alive. And people around them in Virginia and Massachusetts came to, what do you think? And of course, in 24, John's like, my son, hello. But even Jefferson, a Southerner, a slaveholder like Jackson, was like, yeah, no, that Jackson guy, hey, you don't want to go down that road. And he begins backtracking Jefferson from some of his earlier comments that would suggest, oh, he also likes democracy. You could see him saying, well, I like what I like, but whatever Jackson's out, nah, he's calling it democracy, but nah, no, I don't think it's the way to go. So he's backing down. So we're going to walk through these. Each one of these could be their own topic, so I got to go quickly through them. So they may raise questions in your mind, and you can ask me when we get to the end, but I'm confessing early that we won't go as deep as you may wish to go through. Let's start with Native American removal. This is the one that hurts our hearts the most. The Native American peoples had suffered in the crisis and the clash of cultures from the time the Europeans first arrived. It actually happened long before that. Go ask the Apache what happened when the Comanche rolled into their lands and took over basically all of West Texas, or to the tribes in Central America when the Aztecs showed up. So this idea of clash of cultures, it's not European only. It's another thing. At this point, the tribes were very limited in the east, but most of them lived in the southwestern, so modern-day Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas area. And as the South is now beginning to try to grow and get more financial support for its industry of cotton, they're finding out there's a lot of good land over there. Unfortunately for the Cherokee in particular, but also for the Creek, gold is discovered in Georgia, and you and I know what that does to people. And so in the process, Jackson wants to deal with this. And what he wants to do basically is get federal approval for the president to be able to construct treaties which will exchange land from here to land we have due to the Louisiana Purchase. That's what he wants. Now, this is highly debated in Congress. He, in 1829, placed it part of his annual message. He says it'll be voluntary, of course, but if they don't go, they have to become citizens. At this point, we're still wrestling with, what do we do with these people? Are they meant to be citizens? Are they not meant to be citizens? The Cherokee, now for about 20 years, as a tribe, had taken the position of, we would like to be kind of an equal participant in the story. We don't want to leave, but we don't necessarily want to become citizens, but maybe we could become our own state. No. But others had not. And of course, the opinion of most Anglo-Americans was horribly negative, but not all. And you can see that his bill that he puts into Congress is opposed. It's not just a cakewalk through Congress. It does pass, and does pass relatively easily, but it's opposed. In the process, though, something surprising happens that had never been seen before. You all of a sudden start having the president individually contacting different members of Congress, putting personal pressure on them to vote his way with this. And he's accused in Congress of meddling with the decision. Meaning, in the minds of the Congress leaders at this point, the executive office is over there, and you've got nothing to do with what we do. Today, that'd be quite normal, but just to show you kind of how this difference lies. The Southerners, of course, are worried about a whole different issue on the slavery front, and they want this land because they're wanting to make sure they can continue to go. And so this is the beginnings when you start talking about Civil War history of kind of the sectional divide between the South and the North. So there's a whole other piece of the puzzle that's falling into this. But they want this land. Go back to the map for a second. You know, obviously that's a large section of land here and here that Southerners are like, yeah, we could be stronger. I mean, that's almost more than half of Mississippi. So we want this land, kind of a thing. So eventually it will pass. The Cherokee will try to fight it in court, and this becomes important also again for what we're seeing Jackson does here and how he uses presidential power. Now the first case, the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, will be tossed out because you don't have standing in the U.S. court because you're independent. So 2 Methodist missionaries will go to Georgia, go to Cherokee land, intentionally get arrested so they could sue. So they do sue, and that is Worcester versus Georgia. John Marshall is the Supreme Court Chief Justice. He's the longest to date, longest sitting Supreme Court Chief Justice. Marshall had famously been at the forefront of the Marbury v. Madison debate in 1803, in which he chose to not confront the president, Jefferson, who he hated, because he was afraid that the Supreme Court would not have the power to pull off making the president do something. In other words, there's nothing in the Constitution that somehow suggests that the Supreme Court has any kind of power over the president. Remember, our whole system, and it's not just U.S. viewpoint, the whole system of law basically comes back to you and I agreeing to obey it. That's why you don't have to have a cop at every stop sign across America. I just trust at 3 a.m. or 3 p.m. there's a stop sign, you'll stop. I don't got to wait and look because I'm counting on you as an equal member of our society in that social contract to do that. We know if you choose not to, we have an arm of the federal government in the police to then bring force against you for your failure to comply. But what if that person's the president? They're the chief of the group. Well, Adams would argue that the law applies to first person, last person, rich person, poor person. Marshall would have agreed with Adams, but now, 1803, it's pretty clear Jefferson had told Madison to break the law. He should have ruled against Madison and therefore against the government and told Jefferson, stick it. But he didn't, because he was afraid. So he pulls judicial review out, which is not in the Constitution, which then says the Supreme Court's going to decide if laws are constitutional or not. Okay, well now, here he is, 30 years later, and now Marshall, he's like, yeah, I know I got power. I've been here a long time. I was here before you were, boy. And he rules in favor of the Methodist missionaries, in essence saying to the president, you cannot enforce this law on the Cherokee people. It's a Georgia law, but you basically have to go and fight for these people. And Jackson famously said, make me. Now, he didn't actually say it. He said this, the decision of the Supreme Court has fell stillborn, like a child. Sorry for anybody who suffered through that. And they find it cannot coerce Georgia to yield to its mandate. But the bottom line was he was using his presidential power to not do what the Constitution said, which is enforce the law. He's like, yeah, I'm not going to. It was a massive moment. And of course, ultimately, we know for the Cherokee, they also will be removed. They will have their own, they'll have a trail of tears. They were not the only ones, of course, the Choctaw did as well, and many other Native Americans suffered in that journey. So in this, what we find is, we find the president for the first time becoming involved in congressional actions. We find him ignoring a Supreme Court ruling, basically daring the Supreme Court to do something. And of course, the Supreme Court's got no power. They don't have their own little army. And you have an activist state in this story where he supports them by failing to obey the law. All right? Issue one. Issue two, the bank war. Now, this one's so arcane. It's very difficult for us, particularly with the Federal Reserve. We just kind of accept it. They're going to raise lower interest rates, and you and I are like, whatever. We're trying to just live with it. But at the time, there was a lot of questions about the idea of should there be a bank. And the bank was seen by many people as being part of a cabal, kind of a secret elitist group that only rich people benefited from. And Jackson in particular saw this as the most heinous thing of the American system. Jackson's reflecting many Southern viewpoints. The American system will be very successful in accomplishing its economic growth for the country, but will be deeply unsuccessful in building unity. In fact, you can arguably say that the American system will be the first major step towards civil war, because the South will uniformly come out feeling harmed, feeling attacked through the American system. So the bank had been approved for a certain number of years, and it wasn't supposed to be up for debate for 4 more years, but Henry Clay thought this was a great moment for him to make an attack on Jackson in what he was already, Clay, believing Jackson was expanding power in a way that was very dangerous. So he brings up the bank to be rechartered for 12 more years, I think. And for the first time of any significance, the president vetoes this. Now, the veto happens at the same time as the 1832 election. So Jackson is going to run for re-election. Clay will become his opponent in this election, running for re-election for the 1832 presidential race. So the veto becomes the question, or the bank becomes the question. And what's very interesting to notice, particularly if you're wanting to study both the rise of presidential power, but also the question of democracy versus republic, this is one of the significant moments where it's clear the trajectory of the country is moving away from the founders. Because Clay's going to run his whole campaign basically on the idea of the founders. One, you don't go out and politic, you don't campaign, you don't make a big show of the whole thing, and you're arguing that the voice of the people and the representation of the power of the people is in Congress. Jackson, all the contrary, heavily campaigned, went far and wide speaking to lots of people personally. In other words, that I want to be the president. Like I told you earlier, that for the founders, that's not good, right? And argues through the 32 election of I am the representative of the people, and I best know what they want, and they're looking to me to defend them from excesses of that elite power that would be in places like Congress. And you need to let me do my job. So he goes after it. In it, you see him attack the Supreme Court again. So back in 1819, Marshall's court had ruled in McCulloch versus Maryland. There's 3 or 4 Supreme Court cases, if you ever studied the Supreme Court, which we're going to talk about the Supreme Court in December. One of my friends is going to come do the lecture for us in December. We're going to go into the Supreme Court, the judicial branch. There's 3 or 4 really key cases between, say, 1810 and 1830 that all deal with this question of Hobbesian federal power. And the Marshall Court, because Marshall the Federalist, he's one of Washington's proteges, always ruled on the side of more power to the federal government. But remember, what we're talking about now is not power in the federal government, but where does that power lie? Marshall and the founders would have said, yes, more power to the federal government as exerted through Congress. And now you have Jackson saying, oh, no, you can't trust those Congress people. They're a bunch of elitist snobs. You need to come to me. Who's the only person elected by the whole nation? Well, by the Constitution, no, nobody. But in Jackson's mind, well, the president is. And you see that populist thing starting to happen here, right? So that's kind of the debate that they're going down in the process. But Jackson understood better than Clay where the country was going. So you got to give Jackson the nod for that. He could see and read the tea leaves of how people were perceiving things, and he knew he was widely popular. And so he's going to keep playing that card. There's no reason for him not to play that card. So, again, to the critics, you start having worries about, wait a minute, is this Napoleon all over again? I mean, and now go back to the fear when they wrote the Constitution. He controls the military, and he's a general. He's an actual fighter as opposed to just a person in the office. Well, the election is a slam dunk. It's not even remotely close. Clay does get his home state. He gets a few states up here. There's other people running. Again, this is not some criticism of third parties. It wouldn't really change the election. I wish we had more people running, but that's a different conversation. But again, overwhelming vote support, 77% electoral vote. It's hard to see those numbers. 55% popular vote. And so Jackson's like, I have a mandate from the people. How many times have we heard that? And I'm going to go for it. And so what he does here is he authorizes the Secretary of the Treasury to remove money from the Bank of the United States. Well, that's technically illegal. In general terms, it's illegal, but specifically the structure of the country and the system at that time, that's illegal. So his sitting Secretary of the Treasury is like, no, I can't do that. So fires him. Next guy gets in. I'm not doing that. Fires him. Third guy, not doing that. Fires him. Fourth guy. You'd think we would have had this conversation already, but find out the fourth guy. I need you to be the Secretary of the Treasury. But you can only say yes if you're willing to do exactly what I tell you to do. No questions asked. And this guy's like, oh, yeah, sure. And so he does it. Of course, Congress screams bloody murder because you just openly broke the law, which he did. He moved the money into various state banks because every state at this point had a bank of its own. And he basically picked banks in states that he knew he could trust. So that's why they were called the pet banks. They were Jackson's pets, basically. The people are fully supportive because he's selling this as the Bank of the United States is only aiding the rich elite. Although the moment the money's pulled out, interest takes off, inflation takes off, wages fall, there was a mini depression. I mean, it was sort of a disaster. But Jackson's able to basically tell the people, hey, it wasn't me, it was all these guys. Which is not true, it was him. And so this disaster is taking place. The Senate votes to censor the president. First time that had happened. But Jackson still killed the bank, and he wins the day. So again here, he directly appeals to the people. So this is a key issue. A populist, I must stress this. Again, I'm trying to watch our time here. The founders are not, they had no idea or no designs for the president to ever be popular. They wanted to be the president almost to be invisible. Like you, the people, Like, who's the president? I don't know. What matters to me is who my representative in Congress is. That's what their thought was. So here he's appealing to people. This is a massive move here. And then this idea how he interprets different Supreme Court decisions and then uses the veto as a weapon. 12 vetoes under Jackson, 10 under the 6 previous presidents. Now, we'll see. That's not much. Last one. I'll go really quick here, although this was bigger on the Supreme Court, on the Civil War story. One of the phases of the American system was the tariff thing that I told you about. In 1828, a new tariff is issued. Tariffs are always beneficial for internal industries. They're almost always harmful for exporting industries. The only exporting industry we had at this time period was southern crops, mostly cotton, but rice in South Carolina. So the southern leaders are like, this is killing us. So in 28, the sitting vice president, John C. Calhoun, anonymously writes his opposition to this in the very famous South Carolina Exposition and Protest. And he argues that the state ought to have the right to nullify a law that it doesn't like, that it perceives to be beyond the reach of the power of Congress to have enacted. They weren't making that up. They got that directly from Jefferson and Madison, who in 1799 had written that very idea into the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, which were aimed against an action that had been taken during the quasi-war with France, 1798-1800, under President Adams. In fact, Jefferson took the stance a step further and said, basically, a state can leave the Union if it wants to. Madison's like, you can't say that. So they took it out of the final draft. But the idea of secession will build from this idea of nullification. What this is getting to is what basically, how do I understand the Constitution? Is the Constitution a compact between states when they wrote it in 1787, or is it a contract or an agreement amongst the individual citizens? That phrase, we the people, was actually quite controversial at the convention in 1787. And in the ratification debate, many anti-federalists were like, how dare they? There's no we the people. There's we Maryland. There's we New Hampshire. And so there's a whole issue that we don't have time to get into around that journey, but kind of gets into this question of like, well, what does it mean? What Calhoun is arguing, and he's basically calling out to Jefferson, is it's a compact. And so, like a club you might join at work or when you were in school, some school club, once you join it, you can certainly leave it later. They can't make you stay. In the other idea, which Daniel Webster becomes the chief vocal person, and Lincoln will kind of go down this road with Webster, it's like, no. It was an agreement of individuals. So you as an individual, you want to secede from the country, feel free. Turn in your passport, renounce your citizenship, go off to France or Canada, feel free. Don't come back. But Florida as an entity cannot do that. That's the debate that they're working down. All right? Now, what the South Carolinians had thought was Jackson will certainly support them. He's a Southerner. He's got financial investment in exporting cotton. He's a slaveholder. He didn't. He actually saw the benefit of it for the northern stuff, so he doesn't change it. When it was extended in 1832, South Carolina's leaders had had enough, and they issued an act of nullification saying we will not enforce this law. And they basically called for the state militia to arm itself, and they began preparing for battle. Fortunately or unfortunately, they had a president who was very willing to go rough with them. And so he put before Congress a demand for raising an army. Remember, again, at this point, up till we get past the Civil War, there's no moment where the United States Army is really a standing army ready to move. There's West Point and eventually Annapolis, and we have leaders, but in general terms, there's no standing army. And so Jackson's like, Congress, I need you to give me the money to raise an army. I will personally march this army down to South Carolina and take care of business. South Carolina's leaders knew he wasn't bluffing because this is Andrew Jackson, and he had no problem taking you outside and shooting at you and you at him. He had no problem with that, which we find very strange. I hope you find that strange. He had no problem with that. So they knew he wasn't bluffing. Henry Clay knew he wasn't bluffing either. And so Clay does work behind the scenes to get a compromise, and does get a compromise in March of 1833. And with that compromise, along with the fact that South Carolina's leaders knew Jackson was not bluffing, they backed down. What's our takeaway from this? Well, we can see here he opposes an activist state. Is willing, the very fear Jefferson raised, he's willing to use the army as his own weapon, if necessary, to march against that state. And he is in this saying that I, the president, am the defender of the people. Now, these three moments is what led his opponents to be considering him, he was acting like a king. Because that is exactly how a monarch would work. And so with Jackson, we come to this moment where we see a definitive change in how the presidential actions take place between the first 6 presidents and Jackson. Now the question is, what happens next? Well, unfortunately, rather than going back to before, it's as if a standard had been set that then would continue forward. And we're almost done here, so just a couple more slides. It's important, I think, to kind of make sure you see what is being debated. And I think these 2 quotes from Clay and from Jackson really lay out kind of what we're talking about here. So Clay, we're in the midst of a revolution towards a total change of the Republican character of the government, and here we go, to the concentration of power in the hands of one man. Which was exactly what we've seen, and what the founders did not want to have happening. Jackson, the president has felt it is his duty to exert the power with which the confidence of his countrymen hath clothed him in attempting to purge the government of all sinister influences which have been incorporated with its administration. There's evil in Congress. It's a bunch of elitists. They are distant from the people. Who can the people turn to if Congress is so corrupt? I must be the hero. Now, 1844, sitting President John Tyler will use presidential power to affirm the annexation of Texas without really getting congressional approval. There's a lot more to all these stories, but this is still the takeaway for us. 2 years later, President Polk will basically start a war all by himself, intentionally start a war with Mexico. By moving troops into disputed territory that he knew was disputed and knew would get a Mexican reaction, and then use that as a way to convince the American people, hey, look, they attacked us, and we'll get a war going. And then for some people, this is perhaps most shocking, President Lincoln. Lincoln, of all the previous presidents, Jackson is Lincoln's favorite. Or at least I'll say Jackson was Lincoln's guiding light. Now, it's important for you and I to be fair to Lincoln and say we don't know what kind of president he would have been without the Civil War. Similar when we look at something like George W. Bush. Right? We don't know what he would have been without 9/11. So it's unfortunate that happens. They're not the only 2 presidents that kind of thing has happened to. LBJ, Vietnam, same sort of thing. We don't know. And so you have this. However, when he was president, Lincoln, perhaps even more than Jackson, used executive power in a way that was heavy-handed. He suspends habeas corpus. When the sitting Supreme Court rules against him regarding the Maryland habeas corpus, he just ignores them and basically channels Jackson, saying to Chief Justice Taney, make me. And no problem putting people in jail who he thought were going to be secessionists, that were going to cause him problems. And then, most famously, raised an army. Now, again, you and I most of us would say, well, good job, Abe, because all those things were important to winning the war, particularly in 61 with the raising of the army. And the reason, and again, in his defense, he's raising the armies because Congress is not in session. And it's not 2024 where you could order them to be in session in 48 hours and they could all fly home and be in D.C., right? So it's a very different story at the time. So he had to act on his own. And he admitted in one of his own writings, I may have been acting in an unconstitutional way with presidential power. But it was significant what he did and how he did it. his obviously most famous executive action is the Emancipation Proclamation, which we've looked at different times in here. We won't go into it today. But again, there you have the president kind of acting independently of Congress. The slaves are never freed in this country until Congress passes the 13th Amendment. So, it's interesting kind of watching that. And it does seem, if you're kind of looking at the whole of the country, you have this moment of very little power to Jackson, then it leaps up with Jackson, and then it kind of stays stable with Lincoln until you get to Lincoln, although they're using the same power as Jackson, and then it leaps up with Lincoln. And then after Lincoln, it just accelerates. And we won't go into great detail, just to show you really briefly here. By the 1880s, you have basically the coming of the Populist Party, which is really the birth of what we call the progressive movement. There's a lot more to that. But in general terms, you're kind of moving in this direction. And so going back to the vetoes, for instance, after the Civil War, President Cleveland issued 584 vetoes in 8 years. 584. FDR, 635 vetoes. Look at the executive actions. I tried to break it out because this isn't quite fair because they're in office different times. So look at this column though. From Roosevelt up to FDR. Look at the growth of executive actions. That's a lot. And again, what do you have there? The president operating on his own to make decisions for whatever. Now, some of these are benign. And then some of them are pretty big. If you know your World War II history, of course, you may have heard of Executive Action 9066, which is the one that put the Japanese American citizens into concentration camps. By the time you get past the war, you have historians talking about that we have created what they call the Imperial Presidency. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. being most famous for writing a book about that. I think it's fair to say that when you back up to this for just a second, after FDR, this declines. And from Ike to Reagan, the average was about between 80 a year. And then from Reagan to 21st century, it was about 40. And then President Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden, they were in that range. Trump's a little higher, but comparatively back to, say, from Cleveland through FDR, our current presidents are being very shy with their power, right? So just to make sure I'm not picking on anybody that you think I'm trying to pick on. And this is the end. Do we want an imperial presidency? Now, again, I don't have an answer. I have my personal opinion, which doesn't matter. You are the citizens. You have to decide. But what we really want to try to do is try to highlight for you and me the questions that we're confronted with, right? What do I want for a governance? Do I want a single leader? If I want a single leader, how much power should that person have? What's the issue of popularity? Is it important for them to be popularly chosen? Maybe you do think that's important, and that's your right to think so. Is there a danger involved? I will just say, as I said at the beginning, there certainly seems to be a common refrain in human history of how power corrupts, which of course Lord Acton most famously said. I would offer, from Carl's perspective of listening, I feel like in the past, say, at least 15 years, maybe 20 years, I seemingly hear more often people making statements that suggest, I wish the president would just fix this. I wish the president would just do this. Why can't they just get that done? Which does sound a lot like someone saying, I believe in, an imperial presidency. And again, imperium coming from the Roman word imperium, the right to rule kind of a thing. And so then that leads us back to our questions that I showed you at the beginning that we're trying to at least raise. And I don't need you to have an answer for that today, but I do want you to be thinking about it from a sense of that, particularly we're heading into a presidential election year. But as we kind of look at our civics and, well, what do I think, as me personally, you, meaning you, insert your name, is the right kind of thing. And with that, I will come to an end, and I'll see if you have any questions you would like to ask. Yes.